Jonathan Spire is the Director of Research for the Middle East Forum and a regular Mideast analyst for a number of publications around the world. Thank you to our viewers and listeners at the ILTV News Podcast, and welcome back. I'm Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor, and I'm pleased to have you here. And I'm pleased to welcome you, Jonathan.
Hi there, Maya.
So thanks so much for coming in. You know, it's a very, I want to say, almost exciting times in the Middle East, especially since January 20th and Trump's inauguration, where we're starting to see things really shaking up. But yesterday, we had a really traumatic experience. Not only did we have the joy of 6 hostages coming out, but we also learned that 2 of our hostages were forced to watch this propaganda ceremony in Gaza as the hostages were released and basically told, they're getting out, you're staying in. Talk about the psychological drama and trauma that ensues from that. What is going on here?
Well, I think that Hamas is nervous about the prospect of implementation of the second phase of the ceasefire agreement. And I think that Hamas, as it has done throughout, wishes to leverage the issue of hostages and the very deep concerns of Israeli public opinion regarding the hostages in order to ensure that the government of Israel does indeed move towards implementation of the second phase of the ceasefire agreement. And of course, a way to do that will be and has been to acquaint the Israeli public, so to speak, with the faces and voices of those hostages who have not yet been released. So I think it was a fairly transparent aspect of that ongoing effort, you know, because after all, there have been a lot of hostages and the Israeli public don't have a sense of a relationship with every single one of them. So Hamas is now keen to say, don't forget, you know, not everyone's been released. Here are these 2 nice and defenseless and vulnerable people of yours entirely at our mercy. So unless your government does what we want them to do, they're going to not have a good time of it.
Are you feeling confident in the idea that we will reach a phase 2?
I'm not all that confident of it, actually. I think it remains a very large question mark. The reason is for the following. The reason is the following, I would say, because throughout the war, the government of Israel, I think, has had 2 contradictory aims. One of which, of course, is to ensure the release of all the hostages. And the second is the destruction of the Hamas authority and of Hamas political and military power in Gaza. These 2 goals are, of course, contradictory because it's not, in fact, possible to negotiate with any body and at the same time seek to destroy them. It just doesn't work in real life. So what's happened is that Israel has kind of kicked the can down the road now for a year and a half, at the same time negotiating over hostages, at the same time pursuing a war. And the point at which that logic can no longer be pursued and the contradiction inherent in it becomes apparent is phase 2 of the ceasefire deal, because in phase 2, Israel has to start to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, from Netzarim, from the Philadelphia corridor and so on, and has to begin to move towards, according to the stipulations of the ceasefire agreement, towards a permanent ceasefire with Hamas, as it clearly will be, because Hamas is still de facto the governing authority in Gaza. So I think that the government of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu are reluctant to reach that point. Maybe they would like to keep kicking the can down the road, or maybe they want to get down to pursuing the war in indifference, or not indifference to, but, you know, regardless of the remaining presence of 25 hostages. It's not clear, but they are required
25 live hostages.
25 living hostages, that's right. But as we are told, at least.
Right.
But the contradiction becomes apparent in phase 2. So I think the government of Israel wishes to not get there if it can avoid it.
Well, and it seems to me that also there's this whole concept of, okay, let's say we don't go there and we want, quote unquote, all hell to break loose. I mean, we've been battling, as you mentioned, for almost a year and a half, and Hamas is still de facto in power in the Gaza Strip. So has this war even been effective? I mean, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Israel really can continue with the war, but we're not necessarily making the right headway in order to warrant doing that before we get the hostages out. Yeah,
well, I think that the fact is that the war can be pursued with a number of coherent goals, but none of these have really been pursued so far. What's happened is that Israel has just been sort of engaging in a military campaign in which it goes, for example, famously into the Jabalia refugee camp, you know, and then leaves and then goes back again and then leaves and then goes back again. And this is not really a coherent pursuit of a military or political objective. In my opinion, at least, there are a number of possible war goals which Israel could pursue. It could, for example, pursue the goal of for now at least, restoring Israeli military governance in the Gaza Strip if it wants to destroy Hamas governance. Another possibility would be the possibility that then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was promoting about a year ago, which would be to make use of the number he gave was around 11,000 Gazans who were formerly linked with the Ramallah Palestinian Authority in order to create a new Palestinian or Gaza Authority under the protection of IDF guns and then expand that outwards as territory is taken. Now, one can be in favour or against either of those plans, but they are plans. They are coherent objectives. But just having a military campaign backed up by no coherent political plan of any kind is what has produced kind of fairly obviously the situation in which, okay, well then as soon as you withdraw the immediate presence of military force, the authority that returns is Hamas. But that's because you're not actually trying to replace it. It's very fascinating. Israel has been trying to fight Hamas militarily, but it has not in fact been trying to replace Hamas politically. And the reason for that, I think, is because none of the potential goals, which are the ones I outlined earlier, are really acceptable to various parts of either Israel itself or its allies. The Gallant's idea was rejected by elements of the cabinet because it appears to be working with the Palestinian Authority. But restoring military governance has not really been spoken of in a serious way because the Americans probably wouldn't like that and certain other allies. So again, the response of the government of Israel has been to kind of kick the can down the road on this one as well. And yeah, that's I think where we are now. So that's the reason why there has been no clear solution in place following military achievement because there's been no real attempt to implement a solution.
And it's also probably the reason we haven't had enough military achievement to really be able to call this war a success, despite the amount of infrastructure and Hamas operatives that we've killed.
Well, absolutely right. I mean, to have success, what you have to have, I think, in terms of this war, is the destruction of Hamas governance in Gaza. At the end of the day, military force is there, as the continuation of diplomacy by other means, as Clausewitz said. That's to say, you have to have a political goal behind the use of military force. Since Israel hasn't had one, it can't really have political achievement. If you're not actually trying to do anything coherent, you can't really complain if you don't then achieve very much.
Right, and Hamas is like a centipede. You cut off some of it and it just grows itself back by recruiting more operatives and more military.
It does, but it does that if you're not, if you're not trying to put anything in place which will, for example, handle humanitarian aid.
Right, which actually kill the centipede as opposed to
then you can't complain if the one that ends up handling it. Somebody has to handle it. If you don't want the IDF to do it, then something on the Palestinian side or the Gazan side is going to do it. And as we know very well, the strong force on the Gazan side is Hamas. So it shouldn't really surprise anybody. But I agree that it looks very unimpressive. That's to say, to spend a year and a half of military activity, a massive, powerful military force like the IDF, and at the same time then appear to be unable to replace a small, if brutal and cruel, jihadi Islamist enclave, doesn't look very impressive. But when you take into account that actually Israel hasn't been really tasked with replacing Hamas in any coherent way, then it ceases to be so surprising, I would say.
And it's really striking, Jonathan, to hear you say that, knowing that like a day or two after the October 7th massacre, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stood up and said, in fact, that replacing Hamas militarily and politically was, in fact, the goal of the war.
Indeed.
But as you said, we just didn't actually aim to achieve the goal despite it being said. I mean, it's striking. And I want to take us back for a minute to the hostage situation because we've had two really dramatic days in the last week. One was when we got the Bibas children, not the mother at first, eventually the mother, out of Gaza and determined that they were murdered in November. The babies at the hands of the very extremist movements in Gaza, literally at the hands, physically, tortured. But I was very frustrated, I'll tell you honestly, reading about that and understanding what the IDF had said, given that I feel that in November 2023, we actually knew that. When, in fact, there were statements by the IDF at the time that this family had been killed. Hamas had taken responsibility. The family was supposedly informed. And then it was sort of walked back and it was said, but it could be propaganda. And then we literally resumed. This was at the end of the previous hostage deal.
Yeah.
That was the 29th. On the 30th, we resumed fighting in Gaza. And it sort of just went away. We forgot about it. For an entire year, we used these beautiful red-headed babies, orange-headed babies, as the icons of the hostages, when in fact it's very likely that we knew that we were never getting them back. How do you explain? I mean, I hate to be negative against our government. This is in English. People are going to hear it. But the reality is, how do you explain such a situation? Did we not know that these babies weren't coming home?
I mean, as far as I'm aware, and I'm looking at this as you are, as a member of concerned member of the Israeli public. But as far as I'm aware, the issue is that there was, of course, statements by Hamas that the family had been killed, but there was not clear indications or proof at that time that they had been, and therefore the government chose to continue by saying, well, it's not certain 100%, so we'll assume that they've not been.
But Jonathan, you're a war reporter. How could they possibly get, just from forensic data alone, they were able to determine an entire the entire cause of death, timeline of death, who killed them in one day?
Oh, so you mean? Well,
I mean, the information came out
mean?
Immediately. It wasn't like, okay, now we need to look into how were they killed. Okay, they look like they were strangled. Who did it? How did it happen? We knew everything.
Yeah. Well, I think what we knew, though, was the organization that had been holding them and that had taken them. That's what we knew. At least as far as I'm aware, it's not that we already had the physical proof of how they'd been killed. I'm not an expert in forensic pathology,
no, for sure.
but as far as I'm aware, it is. We are told it is possible within 24 hours or 48 hours to ascertain a cause of death in a dead body. That's we are told. I have no reason to believe that that's necessarily not the case. I suspect it is the case that the government, was fairly convinced that the family were dead prior to, this week. But at the same time, where there isn't 100% proof, then it's understandable, I think, that the government would not declare that. After all, we do remember there was the case also of Danielle Gilboa,
That's true.
Who was forced to take part in a disgusting fabrication, which supposedly showed her own death, and then she turned out to be still alive. So thankfully, so if we're talking about relying essentially on statements coming out of Gaza from the Hamas authorities, I think it is understandable that these are treated with skepticism.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, do you feel that our intelligence then has not been strong enough in order to find and track these hostages? I mean, you said before, we're this huge army and we haven't been able to annihilate Hamas, and likely it's because we haven't set out to do so, but we could if we wanted to.
Yeah.
So why do we not know where these hostages are and how to get them out?
First of all, with regard to knowing where they are, one hears different things. I mean, there have been reports that I know you're aware of which suggest that Israel did have knowledge of where many of the hostages were, but simply because of the way in which they were being held, it was not possible to mount rescue operations with a reasonable chance of saving the hostages' lives. At the same time, though, I would say that, in a way, one of the great stories or major stories of this whole war and what preceded it is a massive Israeli intelligence failure. I mean, I'm not really saying anything that people don't know by saying that. At the end of the day, the great, military or strategic achievement of Hamas prior to October 7th was an act of strategic deception on a historic level where Israel was completely taken in. And there's a whole many varieties and elements of that. But I think what also appears to have been the case is that as a result of Israel convincing itself or being convinced in the years prior to October 2023 that Hamas was deterred, that Hamas had accepted a role essentially as the governors of Gaza and were enriching themselves from that. As a result of concluding that that was the case, it seems very clear that resources, which of course are limited in their very nature for any state, resources available for intelligence collection were simply withdrawn from the Gaza Strip and utilized, perhaps very effectively, but utilized elsewhere. The Israeli system appears to basically have been willfully blind regarding the Gaza Strip in the months prior to October 2023. And of course, that's not something which you can rebuild overnight. Once it turns out that your perception regarding Gaza was shockingly wrong, it doesn't mean that then within a week you can build up the kind of capacities that you would otherwise have had you not been working according to that very flawed conception. And here we are. That's, I think, where we're still at. Now, of course, much has been done in the course of the last year and a half. Yeah. But yes, Israel was willfully blind prior to October 7th as a result of a massive intelligence failure on the strategic level, which then, of course, leads down, as such things do, to additional failures and weaknesses on the tactical level.
So with that, we got these two hostages back over the weekend, hostages that had been kept in Gaza for a decade.
Yeah.
Talk to me about these people. I mean, first of all, they appear clearly psychologically damaged. I think that's a given. What do we expect? I mean, has gone on with these people for 10 years, but also why would Israel leave hostages in Gaza for 10 years? I mean, if we were able to get them out now, why couldn't we have done it before?
Yeah, so we're talking about Avira Mengistu and Hisham Asayid, of course.
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
There's been much discussion regarding these two individuals and the fact that they were left for 10 years. There were, of course, public campaigns both for Avira Mengistu and for Hisham al-Said. Particularly Avira Mengistu and his family and the Ethiopian Israeli community tried hard to mobilize for those individuals. Much has been said, and I think, with a degree of justification, that these individuals did not come, let's say, from the stronger or more central elements of Israeli society, and thus it became a little bit easier for the system to ignore their plight in a way that might not have been possible had they or their families had access to money and influence in the way that perhaps other families of other hostages in the past, we can think of Elchanan Tenenbaum, for example, and others, did have. So I think that's definitely a part of the reality and of the picture. At the same time, I think one should also bear in mind that, again, because as we just talked about, Israel was not looking closely at Gaza. Israel did not have good intelligence coverage, astonishingly, of the Gaza Strip in the period prior to October 2023. It means that we shouldn't just assume that the authorities knew where these guys were. It seems possible that perhaps they were being held in a backyard somewhere and the authorities didn't know where they were, or even if they did, didn't necessarily have the capacity to mount a military operation to swiftly free them. The Gaza Strip is a small area, of course, but it's an area teeming with population. Yeah. And it's not at all impossible to think of a situation where they could have been held in that way, out of sight and out of mind. The two, of course, both were people who had suffered, we hear, from psychological problems prior to their incarceration in Gaza, and indeed the reason, it appears, why both men made their way into Gaza was as a result of, or as a part of these serious psychological problems that they had and have. Hisham al-Said, if I'm remembering correctly, has been diagnosed with schizophrenia prior to going into Gaza. So these are people with very, very serious psychological issues who, of course, have clearly been treated now for a decade in the most hellish and brutal of ways. We hear already of extreme isolation of a kind that can break down even healthy psyches, let alone people who are as psychologically vulnerable as those two men. So I think it's not surprising to see the dreadful state which both of them seem to be in.
And what lessons do we draw from all of this? I mean, now hopefully we're going to get into phase two. As you mentioned, there are about 20 some odd to about 25 live hostages left. Of course, more than double that. And if we talk about the bodies as well, that we will hopefully get out. But then we need to draw some conclusions. I mean, we've been negotiating this way for a couple of decades. I mean, really, if you go back to, Gilad Shalit and before, and we seem to think that this is the way to get hostages out, but clearly it's not working. I mean, especially given that now we're going to have to give up any potential aims that we didn't achieve and we didn't maybe aim to achieve of the war in order to get the hostages out. Many of them are dead, and those that are coming out are definitely not healthy people. So what do we do next?
I mean, my own view, is one which I guess is maybe not popular here in Israel, which is that at the end of the day, if you want to achieve the defeat of these forces, you cannot at the same time negotiate for the freeing of large numbers of hostages. This is a mainstream view, by the way, as you know, in the West. I mean, in the United States, in the United Kingdom also. These are countries which do not negotiate with terrorists in the same way that Israel has done, and Israel's enemies have got used to Israel doing. And we know that can have very tragic results. And I was personally acquainted with one of the journalists, colleagues murdered by ISIS, a U.S. citizen, the late Stephen Sotloff, back in 2014-15 time during the ISIS war. At that time, the United States and the British authorities refused to negotiate with ISIS on principle, and all of the British and American citizens held by ISIS were brutally executed. And the French and Italian and Spanish governments agreed to negotiate, and all of their citizens were freed, presumably as a result of the payment of large amounts of money. My view is that it is a historic task, if Israel wants to survive in this region, that the forces of political Islam and jihadism, which have been raised against it now for the last years and decades, must be decisively defeated. That's not an easy thing, and it's not a nice thing, and it can't be done in an easy and nice way. And it means that sometimes very, very hard decisions have to be taken with regard to the greater interests of the citizenry as a whole, and not necessarily, tragically, that of this or that individual citizen. So I think that's the very, very tough choice which awaits Israeli governments now as we reach the conclusion of this phase, and I'm personally not confident that an Israeli government composed of our current leadership will have the, if I can put it this way, even moral strength to take those necessary decisions. So I'm worried to conclude, or I suspect that, we will be looking at similar episodes in the future, because after all, if you were on the jihadi and Islamist side and you were looking at the events of the last year and a half, what would you conclude from it? What you would conclude, if you were smart, and as you are, imagining yourself as a jihadi for a moment, what you would conclude is right. So the thing we need to do, if we want to paralyze the great, powerful state of Israel with its powerful IDF, is to kidnap a number of Israeli civilian hostages. As once we can do that, all of their strength can be in vain. We can get what we need to get. That's the lesson they're going to learn. And we need to get them to unlearn that if we want to survive and thrive in this very, very tough environment in which we find ourselves.
Now, you mentioned, the former journalist Stephen Satlaf, and the previous wars. You yourself have been in the field many, many times. Iraq, Afghanistan, if I remember correctly. Not Afghanistan, Iraq,
and Syria,
Lebanon. So, tell me a little bit about the environment there. You were just in Syria after the fall of Assad. Talk about what's going on there, what it looks like, and how that influences what's going on here and really in the region.
Well, Syria now is you will not be surprised to hear, is in a state of extreme confusion and mess. I mean, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham organization and its leader, Ahmed Shara, are notionally in power in the country, and Shara is notionally the president of the country. But in reality, when you travel in Syria, what you realize very quickly on the ground is that HTS's authority is actually very, very limited indeed. Let's remember that HTS was an organization of only around 40,000 fighters. It's a considerably small number. And to rule Syria, to govern Syria, you need a lot more people than that. And Ashara and HTS have basically disbanded Assad's police service, and of course Assad's army they're not making any use of at all. So it means they don't actually have enough people to really govern all of Syria. And the result of that, as I witnessed traveling through Syria and through central Syria in mid-January, is that large parts of Syria are effectively ungoverned. First of all, even officially, HTS doesn't control the entirety of Syria, because all of Syria, east of the Euphrates, around 30% of the country's territory, is controlled by the US-aligned Kurdish-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces, which are a separate army and a separate political structure. But even within the areas where HTS nominally controls, down in Daraa province, there is a whole separate military force led by a guy called Ahmed Auda. In Sueda province, there is a Druze military force that holds power on the ground. And in the central desert, the Badia Desert, which I traveled through on the way from Tabqa and the Euphrates River across to Homs and Damascus, nobody's really in control. The last SDF checkpoints are just west of the Euphrates, and then you drive literally for about just under 200 kilometers before you hit the first checkpoint of HTS. You drive through a whole number of empty, deserted checkpoints or former checkpoints of the regime forces. And what you gather from that is that a great part of central Syria is effectively governed by nobody. Now, what's out there in that desert? First of all, Bedouin clans and tribes are out there, some of which sort of prey on unsuspecting drivers along the highways. But secondly, ISIS is out there. ISIS is out there reorganizing. That's where ISIS is lurking, getting ready for its own revival. So it means that Syria is a very, very lightly governed place right now, with all kinds of forces competing on the ground in order to try to gain their own advantage.
So are we at real risk here in Israel? I mean, it seems that we've sort of obviously we talk about it, and we're watching and eyeing Turkish involvement and what will be there, but at the end of the day, I feel like we aren't really taking it seriously as a front, but it sounds to me like we should be.
Yeah, I think that the system is taking it seriously.
You do?
I mean, I think the military and political system is. It's just it's not necessarily being sort of leading the media agenda right now, because so much, as we've discussed, I mean, so many other very dramatic things are taking place a little bit closer to home. Syria is close to home, but these are a little bit closer. Yeah. So I think that's the reason why it's been a little bit out of sight, out of mind, but not for the system. I mean, as we know, the military, in fact, the IDF, have interestingly carved out a kind of de facto buffer zone across into Quneitra province, into the demilitarized zone from the 1974 Separation of Forces Agreement. So the military's been very active, and I think that if I understand the military deployment of Israel across the border, what I think is going on is that Israel has drawn, in a way, similar conclusions to the ones we were just outlining, where, okay, this is a loosely governed place, no one's quite sure who's in control, no one's for sure knows what's going to be coming down the road. So it's a good idea for Israel to have a kind of clear presence a little bit east of the border as a kind of buffer for Israeli communities in the Golan Heights.
Which I guess is similar to what we're trying to do in Lebanon. We pulled back our troops. We left on like 5, hubs, and we're saying, okay, we're going to stay here indefinitely until we feel that Hezbollah has moved behind the Litani River. Do you think that's effective, number one? Do you think the ceasefire is going to last? I mean, we're in the, February 20s right now, and talking about March 2nd, returning all of the residents to the north. So, I mean, kind of balance these two equations for me, what's going on the Syrian border, on the Lebanon border, and how safe we are in Israel right now.
Yeah, my sense with regard to Lebanon was that whilst there was a lot of very, very effective tactical moves, and obviously famously the pagers and the walkie-talkies, but also the ground maneuver was well executed and with minimal losses and inflicted considerable damage on Hezbollah, and of course the killings of the whole leadership echelon of Hezbollah, including the historic leader Hassan Nasrallah and indeed his immediate successor. So these are all very important successes. At the same time, I think there is, again, a little bit of a strategic question mark over this, because whilst everybody's busy celebrating, the fact that there's a new Lebanese president and that the government appears to have not, in its formative statement, didn't mention the resistance, i.e. Hezbollah, and this is all very nice, the basic facts on the ground remain that Hezbollah, whilst it's certainly taken some very heavy blows in recent months, is still stronger, also militarily, than the Lebanese armed forces. And there are no indications that the Lebanese armed forces are actually going to either able to or willing to impose their will on Hezbollah, which means that if Israel pulls back, whatever areas that Israel leaves, it is very likely will fairly soon and certainly eventually be reoccupied by Hezbollah. That's the reason, I think, for the 5 outposts. The 5 outposts are kind of a memory of, if I can put it that way, of a policy which Israel would like to have enacted, which would have been a kind of buffer zone north of the border. By the way, that's what representatives, of course, of the border communities have been asking for the last year and a half. Israel's not, for political and diplomatic reasons and so on, been able to implement such a buffer zone. So what Israel's doing is to have a kind of like mini or tiny buffer zone of just 5 outposts adjoining important communities, so that, as you mentioned, come March 1st, the government can start to say to residents of northern communities, okay, it's safe to come home again. It remains very much open to question, of course, whether residents will heed that advice and whether residents of those communities, looking at the reality on the ground, will say, yeah, something, it is safe to come home again. I would imagine that not everybody will. Some will and some won't.
Well, and especially, this week there was already escalation between Hezbollah and Israel. We targeted some outposts and some other military targets in Lebanon. And certainly this week we buried Nasrallah. And what was interesting is they said, I don't know, the accuracy of the reporting from Lebanon and Hezbollah, and maybe you can shed some light, but they were saying 79 countries were represented at the funeral, and Iran certainly sent their foreign ministry just to show, hey, we're still supportive. We want to let you know, hey, we can't get in through Syria maybe right now, get you the weapons you need, but we're backing you. So that sends a message that Hezbollah is not weak, but rather strong, despite the incredible work, as you mentioned, that Israel did, not only the beepers, but the amazing work, against Hezbollah and against its leadership, really not taking out only the top 2, but really the top 30 or 40 leadership, leaders of Hezbollah. So what is your take on that? Does this mean that not only question of whether the residents will heed the advice, but will Israel have to go back in again? Are we looking at another military operation again in Lebanon in the near future if this is the case on the ground?
Well, I would say that the general picture, including regarding Lebanese Hezbollah, but also regarding other Iranian assets in the region, in Iraq and in Yemen and elsewhere, is that, they've received very serious blows and they are weakened. Their weakness is a perishable asset to Israel. And I think that the system, from what I've been gathering in recent days, the system is aware of it. That's how the system sees it. In other words, yes, they're weak now. It doesn't mean they're going to be weak a year from now. They're weak, but they haven't been destroyed. So now so every day that passes, they're going to be getting stronger again.
Right. But that's generally what's been. Then I feel like, did we accomplish anything? Now, it almost feels like we do that. That's what we've been doing for the last 50 years. That's
right. So I think that's absolutely right. There's this strategy of mowing the lawn, I think it's called, where we weaken the enemy, then the enemy gets stronger again, then we have to do it again a few years further down the line. I think there is a kind of hunger in the system to be done with that, because I think there is an understanding that actually long term, in a way, the strategic view of the Iranian regime was kind of correct. Because what the Iranian regime said was, but if we just gradually weaken, we can make the situation unfeasible for Israel in the longer term. Israel can't just carry on forever doing this. I think in a way the Israeli system has accepted that Israel cannot forever just continue, throwing resources down into weakening these guys every half decade. And my sense is that the thinking in Israel as a result of that is leaning towards decisive action to try to bring down the regime in in Tehran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, in the belief that, and I think it's an accurate belief, that at the end of the day, it is Iranian strength and Iranian assistance which enables these other fronts to maintain themselves. So what I'm hearing a lot, and I think many others have also heard it and begun to write about it, in the system is that Israel is talking about a window of opportunity for a decisive strike on Iranian nuclear capacity sometime over the coming year. If that window of opportunity is not taken advantage of, then it will close after a year or a year and a half. That's to say, Iran will have received advanced or likely to achieve advanced air defense systems, probably from Russia. It will have succeeded in strengthening and replenishing Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iraqi Shia militias and the Houthis and others. So there's a moment now where if Israel is bold, it can try to fundamentally change the equation that you accurately described a moment ago. If that opportunity is wasted, then we're going to be back to, I think, every few years having to do all this all over again.
Now, Jonathan, we're going to run out of time, but just piggybacking on that for a final sentiment, under U.S. President Donald Trump, it seems to be that, number one, he doesn't necessarily want to strike Iran, or definitely not the United States, potentially empowering Israel to do so. When you talk about a decisive strike against Iran and potentially changing the region, Trump does seem like he has a vision for what that might look like. Do you feel that Israel has the capacity and the wherewithal with its current leadership to, A, strike Iran if America, in coordination with America, but on our own, and B, that aside, do you think that our leadership is capable of not just repeating the rhetoric that Trump uses, which we're very good at doing that, and saying, yes, we support 100%, but actually carrying through with that and changing the vision for the region so that we are not mowing the lawn, as you called it, in 5 years, but rather that in 5 years we see a new Middle East?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. One is the kind of opportunity side to it, which comes with regard to, for example, the Abraham Accords and now the hope of something similar with Saudi Arabia. I think that the current government, after all, those achievements did take place under the incumbency of the current political leadership in Israel. So I think those have to be counted to its credit. And I think that there is a kind of clear vision of what needs to be done in that regard. At the same time, I think there is a growing understanding that you can't really have that Middle East of development and advancement and progress at the same time that you have a massive and powerful Islamist axis in the region. These are two paradigms that can't really coexist. One has to defeat the other. Obviously, we don't intend to be defeated by the Islamist axis, but to get what we want, to get to the kind of regime, to the kind of region we want, we have to move forward and effectively defeat that axis. And that, I think, is the thinking behind the current direction of events regarding Israeli governance. As to whether they'll achieve it or not, I don't know. If we look at their current ledger of success over the last year and a half, I guess one is bound to be somewhat skeptical. But certainly there is at least a clarity of goals here. If they will be sufficiently and effectively pursued is another matter, and I guess we're going to find out.
Yeah, well, that's true. I guess we're going to find out maybe next year we can reconvene and hold another podcast, and we'll have some better news to talk about at that time and see some real changes in the region. Jonathan Spyer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Maayan.